Okay, so let's move on then to zombies. Okay, so zombies, we're going to move further than just saying that we're going to really put some flesh on the bones. It's not just an intractable problem, but maybe one answer to it would be one that the physicalists certainly won't like. So remember the notion of supervenience. So the mental supervenes on the physical, in that things that are exactly alike in all physical properties can't differ with respect to mental properties. So it's an asymmetric covariance relation, remember. There's no mental difference without a physical difference. So any change you ever get in a mental state has to be accompanied by some physical difference. And then, of course, that will allow for multiple realizability, which is nice. But you can get changes at the physical level that don't have corresponding changes at the mental level, which also allows for multiple realizability, along with a bunch of other things. So it's asymmetrical in that way. So I've got a quote here from Kim, just specifying again what that is. If an organism is in some mental state M at a time, there has to be some neural physical state such that the organism is in that state at that time, and any organism that's in that state at that time is necessarily in the mental state at that time. It's associated with it. So the mental properties here are being determined by the physical properties. Now we're going to look at the idea of zombies. Now a zombie here is a molecule by molecule physical, functional, psychological duplicate of you, but one that doesn't have any certainly phenomenal states. Okay? Now if you have a creature like that, and if a creature like that is actually possible, then you have breakdown of supervenience, because you get a mental difference, so all of us having phenomenal states and a zombie having none, with no physical difference by stipulation, if that stipulation is possible, that you can have this molecule by molecule physical and functional and so on duplicate. Okay, so there are a couple of kinds of supervenience here. Chalmers talks about them. He talks about global supervenience, so all the microphysical facts in the world logically entail all the facts about consciousness. But that's not primarily what he's interested in. He's interested in local supervenience. So all of the microphysical states in a particular organism, some individual, logically entail all the facts about consciousness in that organism. So it's supervenience locally within organisms that we're interested in here. So that's the target, and Chalmers is going to argue that local supervenience fails, in which case most of the kinds of workable physicalism that we were looking at would also fail if that's true. So he's going to target this local supervenience. He thinks it's the most plausible kind of supervenience for consciousness. But he also thinks that, look, if you really think that global supervenience is important, he could also run a similar argument for that. But he's not going to focus on that in the article that we're reading for today. Okay, zombies. Zombies, we all watch movies and TV shows about zombies, but not usually about philosophical zombies. Maybe there's scope there for a screenwriter, who knows. But philosophical zombies are unlike Hollywood zombies. They're not out to eat your brain or anything like that, and they don't look weird. The whole point is they look exactly like us. They look like perfectly ordinary, normal people. They have the same physical organization, functional states, psychology. They behave the same way. But there's nothing it's like to be a zombie. So I guess one way of getting a handle on the idea here, if you're having trouble, it's not exactly right, but let's say that somebody is sleepwalking, and then they wake up and they say to you, well, you show them a video of them sleepwalking and say, I don't remember any of that. It was nothing it was like. Let's assume that they're actually correct in that memory. There was nothing it was like to be behaving in the way that they were behaving when they were walking around, sleepwalking. That person would have been, in some sense, maybe a temporary philosophical zombie here. Now, it's not strictly speaking correct, but it just gives you an idea about how to get a handle on the idea. So it's just functional duplicate of us, physical duplicate of us, but there's nothing it's like to be that creature. Now, with a real philosophical zombie, there would never be anything it's like to be that creature. It's just got no phenomenal states at all. Now, you might think, well, hang on, like, I mean, these creatures, no less than Hollywood zombies, don't exist. So why should we even be considering them? So the point here is not that they don't exist. It seems like they're conceivable, and we're going to talk more about what that means in a moment. Now, if they're conceivable, then you might further argue that they're possible. They're logically possible, metaphysically possible. And if they are metaphysically possible, that's going to be enough, Chalmers is claiming, for the local supervenience claim to fail. So it doesn't matter, Chalmers thinks, whether they actually implausibly, let's say, exist in our world. It's going to be enough as long as they're possible. So I pulled out some quotes here from an interview with Chalmers that Susan Blackmore conducted in a book of hers. And so this is just explaining this point, okay? So would you like to explain about zombies? And Chalmers says, sure, I think that in the actual world, intelligent behavior and consciousness very likely go together, okay? So when you find a system that's behaving like me, talking like me, it's probably conscious. It's not a philosophical zombie. So Blackmore asks him, well, look, so you're saying that you believe that philosophical zombies are possible, and the fact that we have consciousness means that we have to add something to the explanation. And Chalmers thinks, he says, I think they're probably not possible in the sense that no such thing could ever actually exist in this world. But he thinks it's not contradictory to at least suppose in the imagination that some creature like that could behave like us without having consciousness, or without having any phenomenal states. And that would in turn be an interesting fact about our world, and it would be enough, he thinks, to show that local supervenience fails. So he doesn't have to establish their possibility even in our world, that they could actually start walking amongst us. He just has to show that they're possible in some relevant sense if they're conceivable in some relevant sense. And we'll talk about those relevant senses in just a moment, after we just formalize the argument here so we have a clear grasp of what it's saying. So here's the argument, and it looks very, very like an argument we briefly touched on of Descartes, or a certain way of formulating what he says when we looked at that early on. Premise one, zombies are conceivable. So you can coherently imagine them in some sense. Whatever is conceivable is possible, so the claim goes. Therefore, zombies are possible. Okay, interesting, but where does that get us? Well, you might add another conditional premise. If zombies are possible, local supervenience fails. And we've already explained why that would happen. Because you would get a difference at the mental level with no difference at the physical level, which just straightforwardly contravenes the claim of local supervenience. So if zombies are possible, local supervenience claims. But of course, we've already established that zombies are possible according to this argument, and so we get to establish the consequent of that conditional, therefore local supervenience fails. Now, the kinds of physicalism that we've been looking at require the local supervenience claim, and so if local supervenience claim, or if local supervenience fails, then so does physicalism. And so this is an argument against physicalism. Okay, now we've got to think about these first two premises. So premise 3 there is an interim conclusion, and 4 is just a conditional that we won't worry about for now, and in any case it looks like it would do the work required of it once you've established 3. So we've got to look at 1 and 2. And in particular, a lot of philosophers have focused on 1. Why? Well, because once you grant 1, it's going to be really difficult to deny 2, it seems like. So you've got to try, at least, some physicalist philosophers have thought, to block the argument at one. Show how maybe zombies are not as easily conceivable as you might have thought. And then you've got to have this worry also in the background about whether conceivability is a good guide to possibility. Now, we've used the terminology sometimes of possible worlds, and we haven't really talked about it much or said what it means. A possible world, I mean, it's complicated when you get into possible world semantics and so on, but we're just going to think about it simply. A possible world is not some world somewhere. It's just a logically consistent way that things could be. The actual world is possible because it's actual. The best way of establishing the possibility of something is to show that it's actual. And you could write down, let's say, everything about our world, all of the facts about our world, say, at a time. And that's a possible way things could be. It's the way they actually are. But of course, there's lots of, I could be wearing, you know, brown shoes today instead of sneakers. That's a logically possible way things could be. There's a possible world, as it were, in which I'm wearing brown shoes. It's just a slight change to the way things actually are. It's logically possible. Now, what's not maybe logically possible is that I could be wearing a pair of shoes that are all over red and all over green at the same time. That's not a logically consistent way things could be, so there's no possible world in which that's occurring. So we're just thinking about possible worlds as sets of possibilities, logically possible ways that things could be, states of affairs like that. Okay. Now, we've got to see if conceivability is a good guide to establishing what's possible in that sense. So here's a wonderful American philosopher, Tamar Gendlar. She's done lots of work in all areas of philosophy of mind. But she's got a nice volume that she co-edited on conceivability and possibility, which Chalmers actually has a paper in as well. And they have an interesting introduction. They explain some of these concepts. The book's probably in the library here if you're interested. So you might have a broad sense of what it is to conceive of something. So you just envision it or fancy it, fantasize, and so on. You're just visualizing something or imagining, picturing it in some way. So it's a broad sense of conceivability. But you might also have a narrower sense of conceivability, and as she and her co-author put it in the introduction, you might think it's a capacity that enables us to represent scenarios, possible ways things could be, to ourselves using words or concepts, possibly also sensory images, and so on. And these scenarios purport to involve actual or non-actual things in actual or non-actual configurations. So it's a little bit more tied down. You're actually trying to express it maybe using words or concepts or something. So you'd have to be able to express the possible state of affairs in that way. And it would have to then be free from contradiction. So you can't say that something is both the case and not the case in the same place at the same time. That's not logically possible. And there might also be constraints about saying that things are all over red and all over green maybe at the same time. Now, the idea here is that if conceivability is going to be any kind of guide to possibility, it's going to have to be something like this narrow sense. Okay. So one of the main things we're going to be looking for here is freedom from contradiction. Now, all of this stuff ends up being quite complex, and something more should just be said for the moment without getting too complex about how to be free from contradiction here. So take S to be some proposed or possible, proposed as possible state of affairs. And then you're wondering whether it's conceivable, that state of affairs. So I'm drawing on an article that Chalmers has in that co-authored volume of Gendlar's. So he talks about prima facie conceivable, ideally conceivable, negatively conceivable, and so on. So prima facie conceivable is just like on first appearances. If it just strikes you, yeah, sure, okay, I could maybe imagine that. So that's more like just broad conceivability. You might think, well, then you might think about it harder. Is it ideally conceivable, like rationally reflecting on it in the right way? And there you might start to be trying to tie it to what you could actually express in words or concepts or something like that. And so that ends up being what we're looking for, something ideally conceivable. But there's also negative and positive notions of conceivability. So something might be negatively conceivable if it's not ruled out. So it's conceivable. To think of an example. If it doesn't strike you as being ruled out, even on ideal rational reflection, by other facts in the possible state of affairs that you're trying to represent, then you could say it's negatively conceivable. You're not saying anything positive about what the thing would be here, let's say zombies. You're just saying, well, they're not ruled out by any of the other facts that we're stating in relation to them. And then in particular, what Chalmers wants to get at here is whether something is negatively conceivable where it's not ruled out a priori. That's just sitting in your armchair, not having to go out and do anything, investigation or whatever. It's not ruled out just from sitting in your armchair. But what we need here is something that is non-contradictory in a narrow sense of conceivability that requires more than just that negative conceivability. We need something positive. You've got to have some sort of positive conception of a situation in which that state of affairs that you're imagining could actually be, could be the case. So zombies might be prima facie negatively conceivable. That would be consistent with there not even being ideally negatively conceivable. But even if they are ideally negatively conceivable, they might not still be positively conceivable, which is more or less what Chalmers wants. Yeah. The positive? Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think of an example. Okay. An example, hopefully this will make some sense. I know some of you took my intro unit where we discussed free will a little bit, may remember this. But there's a view about free will, what it is to act freely such that you're morally responsible for what you do, that says you've got to be some kind of a special cause, an agent cause in the world. It's not like any other cause out there. And so some people argue that that's negatively conceivable because it's not ruled out by other considerations. It's questionable whether that's true. But once you start trying to give some positive account of what it would be to be an agent cause, it turns out to be much more tricky. So you're not just saying that it's not ruled out by all of the other things that we think might be going on, and it's fine, maybe we'll grant that. But once you actually say, well, what does it actually consist in then? You've got to give some positive account that goes beyond, it's not simply being ruled out by other things. So it's not just the case that it can't be contradictory, or that it avoids contradiction. You've got to have some positive notion of what the thing will consist in as well. Okay, so look, I spelled everything out in a bit too much detail probably there, but the idea is we've got to have this narrow notion of conceivability that Gendler was talking about. It's got to be at least free from contradiction. Maybe you also have this element of positive conceivability about it. But what about possibility? So we've talked about this before too in my intro unit where we talked about various kinds of possibility. So nomological possibility, that's just that it's consistent with, say, laws of nature, natural laws, laws of physics, and so on. So it's nomologically possible that something could travel faster than a space shuttle. That's perfectly consistent with the laws of nature, laws of physics. An object traveling faster than the speed of light, that's not nomologically possible, okay? So there's a law of physics that says that that's not possible. But it seems like it's logically possible, it's conceivable, and it's logically possible. And then impossibility in any sense, including logical possibility, would be an object's being red and green all over at the same time. So what we're looking for is to avoid that kind of impossibility. We're not just looking for this. We're looking for stuff that's logically possible, it's conceivable, and then seemingly logically possible, and it avoids that kind of logical impossibility that we've got at the top there. So we're going to say that freedom, let's say, from conceptual contradiction implies logical possibility, roughly speaking. So it's not just consistency with the laws of nature we're looking for, it's just whether it's logically possible. Okay, so try to conceive of a shape that's both a square and a circle at the same time, or a cube that's red and green all over at the same time, right? Seems difficult. Seems like you can't do it, actually. Conceiving of, let's say, a square that's also a circle. Now, it doesn't help, of course, that in fact we can specify what it would be to be a square circle. So it would have to be an equiangular, equilateral, rectilinear, quadrilateral, closed plane figure, every point on the periphery of which is equidistant from a single point within it, right? Fine, we can write it down. That's okay. But it's contradictory. Right there, in fact, in the specification of what would be required, we can see that it's contradictory. And so it's not logically possible. So it doesn't help that we can write down. In fact, that's what shows us, in this case, why it's logically impossible. Okay, but then by the same token, try to conceive of a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of a heart, or a functional duplicate of a heart. Now, let's say somebody denies that whatever you come up with there has to be a heart. Okay, a functional duplicate, like an artificial heart, and then somebody says, oh no, that can't be a heart. Or it doesn't have to be a heart. So your diagnosis, presumably, in a case like this would be that this person is simply confused, okay? They're misapplying the concepts. They're not actually understanding correctly what's going on. Artificial hearts are perfectly conceivable. They're not ruled out by the use of our terms. They're not contradictory in some sense, in the way that the specification of what a square circle would be was. And so they're logically possible, and worse, I mean, for the person who denies that it has to be a heart, based on empirical evidence, it seems like they're nomologically possible as well. But now imagine Chalmers says a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of a human, or a functional psychological behavioral duplicate of a human. And imagine that somebody denies that it has to be conscious. So zombies are conceivable. They deny that that duplicate has to be conscious. Are they similarly confused or merely misapplying concepts? Chalmers thinks, no, the burden of proof is on anybody who wants to deny that zombies are conceivable. It's not like the duplicate heart situation at all. Now you might say, well look, try harder and you'll see that you actually can't imagine zombies, and Chalmers just says, no, look, you're just adding complexity, imagining more details, and that doesn't conceptually entail consciousness. So unlike the heart situation, he thinks that zombies really are conceivable. And if you grant that, then it's going to be an easy enough step to show that they're possible, in which case the whole argument goes through and physicalism would be false. So he thinks that this is the hard problem of consciousness, is explaining qualia or phenomenal consciousness like that everything else, easy problems he calls them, okay, are just answerable by doing science, cognitive neuroscience and psychology, say. A bunch of examples he even talks about himself, how do we discriminate sensory stimuli, and so on. By contrast with empirically tractable so-called easy problems like that, he thinks the hard problem is how do physical processes in the brain at all give us subjective experience, give us phenomenal states or qualia. And he thinks that given any account of those processes, there's always going to be a further question. Why are they accompanied by conscious experience? And he thinks that's the real hard problem. That's the problem we need to focus on, not all of these easy problems.